The stagecoach lurched over another rut in the road, and Margaret Hayes gripped the wooden seat beneath her, fighting the wave of nausea that rose in her throat. At 42 years old, she thought bitterly, she should be settled in a comfortable home with grandchildren playing at her feet, not bouncing along a dusty trail toward an uncertain future in Montana territory. She glanced down at the worn letter in her lap, its edges soft from repeated reading. The handwriting was neat but unpracticed. The words of a man clearly uncomfortable with written expression. Seeking a mature woman for housekeeping and care of 2 young children, room, board, and modest wage provided. Must be of good character and willing to relocate to remote ranch. Mature, that was one way to put it. Margaret knew what she was. A widow past her prime, with silver threading through her brown hair and lines etched around her eyes from too many years of worry. When her husband had died 3 years ago, leaving her with debts she couldn't pay, his family had made it clear she was no longer welcome. Too old to remarry, they'd said. A burden. The stagecoach driver's voice called out, rough and cheerful. Boulder Creek Station, ma'am. This is your stop. Margaret's heart hammered as the coach rolled to a halt. Through the dusty window, she could see a weathered building that served as both trading post and stage stop, and beyond it, endless rolling hills dotted with pine trees. The Montana sky stretched overhead, impossibly blue and vast. She stepped down from the coach, her legs unsteady after days of travel. The driver handed down her single trunk. Everything she owned in the world fit into that battered case. Someone meeting you, ma'am? The driver asked. Before Margaret could answer, a voice cut through the afternoon air. Mrs. Hayes? She turned and felt her breath catch. The man standing before her was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 at most, and tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He wore dusty work clothes and a hat that had seen better days, but there was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that made her pulse quicken in a way she hadn't felt in years. I'm Connor Blake, he said, removing his hat. His hair was dark, sun-streaked at the temples, and his eyes were an unusual shade of green that seemed to see right through her. Thank you for coming all this way, Mr. Blake. Margaret's voice came out steadier than she felt. She'd expected someone older, perhaps a widower her own age. This man was young enough to be, well, not her son, but certainly... I know what you're thinking, Connor said quietly, and there was something raw in his expression. The advertisement didn't mention ages. I'm 31, and you're probably wondering what kind of man that young needs to hire help instead of finding a wife. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. I wasn't. It's a fair question. He gestured to a wagon nearby. Let me get your trunk, and I'll explain on the way to the ranch. It's about an hour's ride. Andrei. As Connor lifted her trunk with ease that spoke of hard physical labor, Margaret noticed the way other men at the station watched him, with a mixture of respect and something that might have been pity. What story did this young man carry? The wagon ride began in awkward silence. Margaret sat primly on the bench seat, very aware of Connor's proximity. He was broader through the shoulders than she'd first realized, his hands capable and scarred from work as he guided the horses along the narrow trail. My wife died 2 years ago, Connor said finally, his voice low. Childbirth. The baby. Our daughter Sarah. She survived, but Mary didn't. He paused, jaw tight. My son Thomas was only 3 at the time. He's 5 now, and Sarah just turned 2. I'm so sorry, Margaret said softly. Connor nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I've been managing alone, but it's not fair to the children. Thomas is wild as a Mustang, and Sarah needs a woman's care, things I don't know how to give her. His hands tightened on the reins. I know I could remarry. The local women have made that clear enough, but I can't. He stopped, his voice rough with emotion. You're not ready, Margaret finished gently. His green eyes met hers, surprised. No, I'm not. They rode in more comfortable silence for a while. The landscape was breathtaking. Mountains rising in the distance, valleys thick with wildflowers, the air so clean and clear it almost hurt to breathe. Why did you answer the advertisement? Connor asked. A woman like you, educated, well-spoken, you could have found work anywhere. Margaret let out a bitter laugh. A woman like me. Mr. Blake, I'm 42 years old. My husband's family made it very clear that I had outlived my usefulness. I have no children of my own, no family, and limited options. She met his gaze steadily. I answered because I need this position as much as you need someone to fill it. Something shifted in Connor's expression, understanding perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. Then I'm grateful you did. The ranch, when it came into view, was more substantial than Margaret had expected. A sturdy two-story house, a large barn, corrals with horses, and beyond them, vast stretches of grazing land. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way. As the wagon rolled to a stop, the front door burst open, and a small whirlwind in the form of a 5-year-old boy came racing out. "Papa! Papa's home!" Thomas had his father's dark hair and something of his features, but his eyes were bright blue. His mother's eyes, Margaret guessed. "Easy, son." Connor jumped down from the wagon, catching the boy as he launched himself forward. "We have a guest. This is Mrs. Hayes. She's going to be staying with us, helping take care of you and Sarah." Thomas's enthusiasm dimmed slightly as he looked at Margaret. "You're old," he said with the brutal honesty of childhood. "Thomas!" Connor's voice was sharp, but Margaret laughed. A real laugh that felt good after so many grey months. "I am indeed. Much too old to chase wild boys around the ranch, so you'll have to behave yourself." Thomas considered this, then grinned. "Can you cook? Better than your father, I'd wager." "She's got you there," a weathered voice said from the doorway. An older man emerged, bouncing a small girl on his hip. "I'm Jack Riley, ranch foreman. And this little angel is Sarah." The child had wispy blonde curls and the same blue eyes as her brother. She regarded Margaret with solemn curiosity, one tiny fist clutched in Jack's shirt. "She's beautiful," Margaret said softly. Connor reached for his daughter, and Sarah went to him willingly, tucking her head against his shoulder in a gesture that made Margaret's heart squeeze. Whatever else this young man might be, he clearly loved his children fiercely. "Let me show you to your room," Connor said. "Jack, can you bring Mrs. Hayes's trunk?" The room was small but clean, with a window overlooking the ranch yard and mountains beyond. It had a real bed with a quilt, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. More than Margaret had dared hope for. "It's perfect," she said. Connor stood in the doorway, Sarah still in his arms. "I want to be clear about expectations," he said quietly. "I need someone to cook, keep the house, and mind the children. I can't pay much beyond room and board, but you'll be treated with respect. This is your home as long as you want it to be." "And what do you expect from me, Mr. Blake?" His green eyes held hers. "Kindness to my children, honesty, and perhaps," he hesitated, "perhaps patience with the man who's forgotten how to be around women. I've been alone a long time." Something warm unfurled in Margaret's chest. "I think we can manage that." The first weeks passed in a blur of establishing routine. Margaret rose before dawn to start the stove, prepare breakfast, and begin the endless tasks of running a household. Thomas was indeed as wild as a Mustang, constantly dirty, full of questions and prone to mischief. But he was also sweet-natured, quick to laugh, and desperately hungry for affection. Sarah was quieter, more watchful. She would sit on the kitchen floor while Margaret worked, playing with wooden spoons and scraps of fabric. Gradually, she began to warm up, reaching for Margaret's skirt when she wanted to be held, falling asleep in her lap after supper. Connor was complicated. He rose even earlier than Margaret, working from dawn until after dark most days. He was unfailingly polite, thanking her for meals, asking after her comfort, but maintaining a careful distance. At first, Margaret thought he was simply reserved by nature, but then she began to notice the looks, the way his eyes would linger when she bent to pick up Sarah. How he'd pause in the doorway, watching her move around the kitchen, the way his jaw would tighten when she laughed at something Thomas said. It unsettled her. She was 42, for heaven's sake. Plain, aging, hardly the sort of woman a virile young man in his prime would notice. Yet there was something in Connor Blake's gaze that made her feel seen. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Margaret was washing dishes when Connor came in from the barn. The children were already asleep, and Jack had retired to the bunkhouse. "Mrs. Hayes," Connor said, "could I speak with you?" Her hands stilled in the dishwater. "Of course." He crossed to the table, his movements restless. "I wanted to say, that is, I've noticed." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated with himself. "You're wonderful with the children." "Thank you. They're easy to love. Thomas talks about you constantly. And Sarah, she hasn't taken to anyone this way since her mother died." Connor's voice was rough with emotion. "I can't thank you enough for what you've given them. I'm only doing my job, Mr. Blake." "Connor," he said suddenly. "Please, call me Connor. Mr. Blake makes me feel like we're strangers, and we're not, are we? After living under the same roof, sharing meals." "No," Margaret agreed softly. "We're not strangers." He moved closer, and Margaret was suddenly very aware of how small the kitchen felt, with his large frame filling it. He smelled of hay and horses and clean sweat, masculine and earthy. "May I call you Margaret?" he asked. The way he said her name, with that slight roughness in his voice, made something flutter in her stomach. "Yes." They stood there, the silence stretching between them, charged with something Margaret couldn't name. Connor's eyes had darkened, his gaze dropping to her mouth before jerking away. "I should let you finish," he said abruptly, stepping back. "Good night, Margaret." "Good night." She watched him go, her heart beating too fast. This was madness. She was a middle-aged widow, and he was a young man still grieving his wife. Whatever she thought she felt, whatever she imagined she saw in his eyes, it couldn't be real. But the looks continued, the charged silences, the accidental touches when passing in narrow doorways, when he'd reach for the same dish she was holding, when their hands would brush and they'd both pull away like they'd been burned. Margaret tried to ignore it, throwing herself into her work. She baked bread, mended clothes, kept the house spotless. She taught Thomas his letters and numbers, sang Sarah to sleep, created a home out of what had been just a house full of grieving males. And at night, alone in her room, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. She was falling in love with Connor Blake. It was foolish, impossible. He was 11 years younger, still in love with his dead wife, and she was just the hired help. But her heart didn't seem to care about any of that. The crisis came on a cold October evening. Margaret had put the children to bed and was in the kitchen preparing tomorrow's bread dough when Connor came in from checking the stock. His shirt was torn, blood seeping through the fabric. "Connor!" She was at his side in an instant. "What happened?" "Just a stupid accident." His voice was tight with pain. "Caught my side on a broken fence rail. It's nothing." "Sit down. Let me look at it." "Margaret, I'm fine." "Sit down." Something in her tone made him obey. Margaret fetched clean cloths and water, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "I need to see the wound. Can you remove your shirt?" Connor hesitated, then slowly unbuttoned the shirt, hissing in pain as he pulled it away from the injury. Margaret's breath caught, not at the wound, which was nasty but not deep, but at the sight of him. Connor Blake was beautiful. Broad shoulders, muscled from hard work, skin tanned and marked with scars. He was vital and strong and utterly male, and Margaret felt heat flood her face. "It's bad, isn't it?" Connor asked, misreading her reaction. No, it's not deep, but it needs cleaning." Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. She began to clean the wound with gentle efficiency, very aware of Connor's shallow breathing, the way his muscles tensed under her touch. When she leaned closer to examine the cut, his hand suddenly caught her wrist. "Margaret," his voice was strained. You should know that having you this close, touching me, it's not easy." She looked up, finding his green eyes blazing with an intensity that stole her breath. "Connor, I know I shouldn't feel this way," he continued, his words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "You're here to care for my children, not to... and I'm too young for you, I know that. But God help me, Margaret, I can't stop thinking about you." Her heart was pounding so hard, she could barely hear her own voice. "You're not too young, I'm too old." "You're not." His free hand came up to cup her face, calloused fingers, infinitely gentle. "You're not too old, not too anything. You're perfect." "Connor, I'm 42 years old. I have grey hair and wrinkles, and I'm a man who hasn't felt alive in 2 years until you walked into my life." His thumb brushed her cheek. "I'm a man who watches you with my children and feels his heart break open. I'm a man who lies awake at night, thinking about you sleeping just down the hall." "This is crazy," Margaret whispered, but she didn't pull away. "I know." He leaned closer, his forehead nearly touching hers. "Tell me you don't feel it too. Tell me I'm imagining this thing between us, and I'll never mention it again." But she couldn't lie. "I feel it," she admitted. "I've felt it since the day we met." The kiss, when it came, was gentle, almost reverent. Connor's lips brushed hers softly, questioningly, giving her every chance to pull away. But Margaret found herself leaning into him instead, her hands coming up to rest against his bare chest, feeling his heart hammer beneath her palms. He deepened the kiss slowly, his hand sliding into her hair, and Margaret felt something inside her unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. She'd been married for 15 years, But she'd never been kissed like this, as if she were precious, desired, essential. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Connor rested his forehead against hers. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have. Don't you dare apologize." A smile tugged at his lips. "No, no." Margaret's hands were still on his chest, and she could feel him trembling slightly. "But Connor, we need to talk about this. Really talk." He nodded, pulling back slightly, immediately wincing. Margaret remembered the wound she'd been tending. "Let me finish bandaging you first," she said. "Then we'll talk." Her hands shook slightly as she cleaned and wrapped the injury, hyper-aware of every place their bodies touched. Connor watched her with those intense green eyes, and she could feel the heat of his gaze like a physical touch. When she finished, he caught her hand again. "Come sit with me." They moved to the kitchen table, sitting close but not touching, the space between them crackling with tension. "I loved my wife," Connor said quietly. "Mary was sweet and kind, and we were happy. But Margaret, I was 27 when I married her, barely more than a boy. I didn't know—" He paused, searching for words. "What I feel for you is different, deeper. You've lived, you've suffered, you understand things Mary never could have." "You're romanticizing me," Margaret said, but her voice was gentle. "I'm just a woman, Connor, an ordinary woman past her prime." "Past your prime?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Margaret, you're the most vital, alive woman I've ever met. The way you move, the way you laugh, the way you love my children, there's nothing ordinary about you. I'm old enough to—" "Stop." His hand found hers on the table. "Stop talking about your age like it's a flaw. I don't care if you're 42 or 52. I care that when you smile, I feel warm. I care that when you sing Sarah to sleep, I want to stand outside the door just to hear your voice. I care that you make this house feel like a home again." Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. "What are you saying?" Connor took a deep breath. "I'm saying that I'm falling in love with you. And I know it's only been 2 months. And I know this is probably too fast, but Margaret, I want you to stay. Not as the housekeeper, as mine. Yours?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "My wife, my partner, the mother my children already see you as." He squeezed her hand. "I know I'm asking a lot. I know I'm younger, and you might not—" "I love you too," Margaret interrupted. "God help me, I've been falling in love with you since you lifted my trunk at the station." The smile that spread across Connor's face was like sunrise. "Then why are we fighting this?" "Because I'm scared," she admitted. "What if you wake up one day and realize you've tied yourself to an older woman? What if—" Connor stood, pulling her up with him. His hands framed her face and his eyes were blazing. "Listen to me. I've had 2 years to think about what I want in a partner. I want someone who knows that life is hard and love is precious. I want someone who's lived enough to appreciate what we have. I want you, Margaret Hayes, exactly as you are." "I'm too old for you," she whispered. But it was a weak protest now. Connor's lips curved in a smile that made her knees weak. "Then teach me," he said softly. "Teach me how to love you the way you deserve." And then he was kissing her again, and Margaret let herself fall into it, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, second chances were real. The next weeks passed in a blur of quiet joy. Connor courted her properly, despite living under the same roof, stealing moments alone when the children napped, holding her hand when they sat together after supper, kissing her goodnight at her bedroom door with a restraint that both frustrated and moved her. "I want to do this right," he told her one evening, his arms wrapped around her waist as they stood on the porch watching the sunset. "I want everyone to know that you're not just the housekeeper. You're the woman I love." "The scandal will be terrible," Margaret said, but she was smiling. A younger man and his older bride. Connor turned her in his arms, his expression serious. "Let them talk. I don't care what anyone thinks except you and the children." The first real test of their relationship came the following Saturday, when Connor announced they needed to go into Boulder Creek for supplies. "All of us?" Margaret asked, her stomach tightening with nervousness. "All of us," Connor confirmed, his green eyes holding hers with quiet determination. "It's time people knew how things stand between us." The ride into town was filled with Thomas's excited chatter and Sarah's delighted giggles as she bounced on Margaret's lap. But Margaret could feel her anxiety building with each mile. What would people say when they saw her with Connor? Would they assume she was trying to trap a younger man? Would they pity him for settling for an older woman? Connor seemed to sense her thoughts. His free hand found hers on the wagon seat, squeezing gently. "Trust me," he murmured. Boulder Creek's main street was busier than Margaret had expected. Wagons and horses lined the dirt road, and people moved between the general store, the bank, and the small hotel. As Connor helped Margaret down from the wagon, she felt eyes turning toward them. Mr. Blake, a portly man in a suit, approached, his expression friendly. "Good to see you. And this must be the new housekeeper we've heard about." "Mrs. Hayes is much more than a housekeeper, Mayor Thornton," Connor said firmly, his hand settling possessively at the small of Margaret's back. "She's the woman I intend to marry." The silence that fell was almost comical. Mayor Thornton's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Behind him, several townswomen had stopped mid-conversation, their eyes wide. Margaret felt heat flood her face, but Connor's hand remained steady against her back, anchoring her. "Well," the mayor finally managed, That's wonderful news, Blake. Congratulations." "Thank you, sir." Connor's voice was polite, but held an edge that discouraged further comment. "If you'll excuse us, we have shopping to do." As they walked toward the general store, Margaret was acutely aware of the whispers following them. An older woman with steel-grey hair deliberately turned away. Two younger women giggled behind their hands. "Connor," Margaret whispered urgently, "maybe we should—" "Hold your head high," he interrupted softly. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." Inside the store, Mrs. Henley, the proprietor's wife, greeted them with professional politeness that couldn't quite hide her curiosity. As Margaret selected flour, sugar, and other necessities, she could feel the woman's eyes assessing her, cataloguing every grey hair, every wrinkle. Thomas, oblivious to the tension, ran to the candy jars. "Papa, can we have peppermints?" "May we?" Margaret corrected automatically, then caught herself. She had no right to correct Connor's son, not really. But Connor smiled. "What do you say, son? May we have peppermints?" "Please, Papa. Ask Mrs. Hayes. She's in charge of treats." Thomas turned his bright blue eyes on Margaret. "Please, Mrs. Hayes. Sarah loves peppermints too." The simple request, the easy way Connor had deferred to her authority, made Margaret's throat tight with emotion. "Of course you may, but only 2 pieces each, or you'll spoil your supper." Mrs. Henley's expression had softened slightly. "You're good with the children," she observed. "They make it easy," Margaret said honestly. "They're wonderful children. Their mother was a dear friend of mine," Mrs. Henley continued, and Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Mary was sweet as sugar, pretty as a picture. Gone too soon." "I'm sure she was," Margaret said quietly. "The children speak of her with such love." "Do they?" The older woman's eyes searched Margaret's face. That's good. I was worried they'd forget her." "Never," Margaret said firmly. "Mary will always be their mother. I could never replace her, nor would I try. But I hope to give them love and care in the present, as she would have wanted." Something in Mrs. Henley's expression shifted. A grudging respect, perhaps. "You seem like a sensible woman, Mrs. Hayes." Not many would see it that way. Connor appeared at Margaret's side, his arms full of supplies. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Mrs. Henley said briskly. "Will this be all for you today?" As Connor paid for their purchases, Margaret noticed a young woman entering the store. She was perhaps 23 or 24, blonde and pretty, with a figure that made Margaret acutely aware of her own aging body. The woman's eyes found Connor immediately, and her face lit up. "Connor Blake! I haven't seen you in months." Connor's expression became carefully polite. "Miss Peterson, how are you?" "Much better now that you're here." The young woman, Miss Peterson, moved closer, completely ignoring Margaret. "Papa was just saying we should have you over for supper. It's been too long since you've had a proper home-cooked meal." "Actually," Connor said, his hand finding Margaret's, "I've been enjoying Mrs. Hayes's cooking. She's an excellent cook." Miss Peterson's blue eyes finally acknowledged Margaret's existence, and the look she gave her was pure poison. "Oh, the housekeeper. How convenient for you." "Fiancé," Connor corrected, his voice like iron. "Mrs. Hayes has agreed to be my wife." The color drained from Miss Peterson's face, then flooded back in an angry red. "You're joking. She's old enough to be your—" "Careful," Connor interrupted, his voice deadly quiet. "You're about to say something you'll regret about the woman I love." Miss Peterson looked between them, her expression a mixture of shock and fury. Then she turned on her heel and fled the store. Margaret felt shaken. "Connor, perhaps we should reconsider—" "No!" He cupped her face in his hands, right there in the middle of the store with Mrs. Henley and several other customers watching. "I meant every word. You're the woman I love, and I don't care who knows it." Then he kissed her, not a chaste peck, but a real kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. When he pulled back, Margaret was breathless and blushing, but she was also smiling. Mrs. Henley cleared her throat. "Well, that's quite clear then," but there was a hint of approval in her voice. The ride back to the ranch was quieter. Thomas and Sarah had fallen asleep in the back of the wagon, and Margaret sat close to Connor, his arm around her shoulders. "I'm sorry about Miss Peterson," Connor said. "Lydia has been persistent. She's young and beautiful," Margaret said. "Everything I'm not." Connor pulled the wagon to a stop, right there in the middle of the trail. He turned to face Margaret, his green eyes intense. "She's shallow and vain. You're deep and real. She sees me as a prize to be won. You see me as a man, flawed and grieving and trying to do right by his children." "Connor, when I look at Lydia Peterson, I see a girl playing at being a woman. When I look at you, I see strength and wisdom and a heart that's been broken and healed stronger." His hand came up to trace her cheek. "You think your age makes you less. It makes you more. It makes you everything I need." Margaret kissed him then, pouring all her doubts and fears and desperate hope into it. When they finally broke apart, Connor was smiling. "When we get home," he said, his voice husky, "I need to talk to you about something important." The something important turned out to be a small velvet box that Connor pulled from his pocket that evening after the children were in bed. Margaret's heart nearly stopped when she saw it. "This was my grandmother's ring," Connor said, opening the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small but beautiful sapphire. "She gave it to me before she died, and made me promise to give it to a woman who deserved it. Not just someone pretty or young, but someone with substance, someone real." Tears blurred Margaret's vision. "Connor, I know we've only known each other a few months," he continued. "I know people will talk, but Margaret, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. You're my second chance at happiness, and I'm yours. Why should we wait?" "I don't want to wait," Margaret whispered. "I want to be your wife. I want to be a mother to Thomas and Sarah. I want to build a life with you." Connor slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. "Then marry me soon. Next month, next week, tomorrow, if the preacher will do it." Margaret laughed through her tears. "Next week seems reasonable," but Connor's expression grew serious. "There's something else you need to know. Something I should have told you before." Margaret's heart clenched. "What is it?" "The ranch. It's not just doing well, it's thriving. I've been careful with the money, invested wisely. Margaret, I'm not a poor rancher scraping by. I have means." He paused. "I need you to know that I'm not marrying you for practical reasons. I don't need a housekeeper or a nanny. I need you. Just you." "I never thought," Margaret started, but Connor shook his head. "I see it in your eyes sometimes. The fear that I'm settling, that this is just convenient for me. It's not. You could demand a mansion in San Francisco and an army of servants, and I'd give it to you if it would make you happy. But I think what would make you happy is right here, this ranch, these children, and me." "You're right," Margaret said softly. "This is exactly where I want to be." That night, Margaret lay in her bed alone. Connor was determined to do things properly until their wedding day, and twisted the ring on her finger, watching the sapphire catch the moonlight. In 1 week, she would be Mrs. Connor Blake. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Margaret was kneading bread dough when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Through the window, she saw an elegant carriage, far finer than anything she'd seen in Boulder Creek. Connor came in from the barn, his expression puzzled. "Are you expecting anyone?" Before Margaret could answer, a tall, dignified woman in her 60s descended from the carriage, followed by a younger woman who looked to be in her 30s. "Connor Blake," the older woman said in a voice that commanded attention. "I'm Eleanor Morrison, and this is my daughter Catherine. I believe we need to talk about your engagement." Margaret's stomach sank. The Morrisons were the wealthiest family in the territory, owners of the largest ranch for 100 miles. What could they possibly want with Connor and her? Connor's expression had gone carefully blank. "Mrs. Morrison, Miss Morrison, won't you come in?" Inside the house, Margaret hastily wiped flour from her hands and smoothed her apron, feeling desperately inadequate next to the Morrison women's elegant traveling dresses. "Mrs. Hayes, I presume?" Eleanor Morrison said, her sharp eyes taking in everything. "The woman who's captured our Connor's heart." Yes, ma'am," Margaret managed. To her surprise, The older woman smiled. Good. You're not putting on airs or pretending to be something you're not. I appreciate honesty. She settled into a chair without being invited, the gesture both imperious and somehow welcoming. Now then, I've known Connor since he was a boy. His late father worked for my husband before Connor inherited this place. I care about what happens to him. Mother, Catherine Morrison interjected gently. Perhaps we should... Hush, Catherine. I'm getting to it. Eleanor's eyes fixed on Margaret. Word has reached me that Connor intends to marry an older woman, a widow, someone the town gossips have been having a field day with. Margaret felt her cheeks burn, but she lifted her chin. If you've come to talk Connor out of this engagement, Mrs. Morrison, you're wasting your time. I love him, and he loves me. What anyone else thinks doesn't matter. Eleanor Morrison's smile widened. There it is, the backbone I was hoping to see. She turned to Connor. You've chosen well, boy. Better than you did the first time, if I'm being honest. Connor's eyebrows rose. Mary was a sweet girl who would have made a lovely ornament, but a poor partner for a man like you, Eleanor interrupted. Oh, don't look so shocked. You loved her, I know, but you were children playing house. This, she gestured between Connor and Margaret, this is a real partnership. Catherine Morrison spoke up, her voice warm. What Mother is trying to say, in her tactful way, is that we approve. In fact, we're here to help. Help? Margaret echoed. The wedding. Of course, Eleanor said briskly. Can't have you married in some rushed, hole-in-corner affair that makes it look like you have something to hide. We'll host it at our ranch, make it the social event of the season, show everyone that the Morrison family approves of this union. Connor looked stunned. Mrs. Morrison, that's incredibly generous, but we couldn't... You can and you will, Eleanor declared. I've already sent word to Judge Harrison. He'll perform the ceremony 2 weeks from Saturday. That gives us time to do this properly. Margaret felt overwhelmed. I don't have a proper dress. I couldn't possibly... Mother brought 3 dressmakers, Catherine said with a gentle smile. They're in the carriage. We'll have you fitted today and the dress will be ready in time. But why? Margaret asked, her voice small. Why would you do this for us? Eleanor Morrison's expression softened. Because I've seen too many good people hide their happiness to please small-minded fools. Connor deserves joy after the tragedy he's endured. And you, Mrs. Hayes, deserve to be celebrated, not whispered about. She stood. Besides, I like the scandal of it. An older woman and a younger man, flying in the face of convention. It's romantic. The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind. The Morrison women were true to their word. A beautiful cream-colored dress was made for Margaret, simple but elegant, that somehow made her look ageless rather than old. Eleanor Morrison took it upon herself to spread the word about the wedding, making it clear that anyone who had anything unkind to say would answer to her. That woman is terrifying, Margaret said to Connor one evening as they sat on the porch. Connor laughed. She is, but she's also the most powerful woman in the territory. If Eleanor Morrison says our marriage is respectable, no one will dare say otherwise. I'm still nervous, Margaret admitted, about the wedding, about being in front of all those people. Connor pulled her close. You could walk down that aisle in a flour sack, and I'd still think you were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Liar! Margaret said, but she was smiling. I'm serious. His hand came up to cup her face. Do you know what I see when I look at you? I see the woman who makes my children laugh, who turns this house into a home, who looks at me like I'm worth loving, even when I'm covered in dirt and smell like horses. You always smell a little like horses, Margaret teased, and you always smell like bread and vanilla. Connor murmured, nuzzling her neck. It drives me crazy. Margaret shivered at the sensation. Connor, I know. We're waiting. He pulled back with obvious reluctance. But after the wedding, I'm not letting you out of our bedroom for a week. What about the children? Jack can handle them for a few days. Connor's eyes had gone dark with desire. I plan to take my time learning every inch of my wife. Margaret's breath caught. You're not making this easy. Good. He kissed her, slow and deep, until she was clinging to him. When he finally released her, they were both breathing hard. Sweet dreams, my love. Idudi. As Margaret prepared for bed that night, she thought about how much her life had changed in just a few short months. She'd arrived at Boulder Creek Station, convinced her life was over, and instead, she'd found everything she'd ever wanted. Love, family, purpose, hope. Tomorrow, Connor was taking her to meet some of the neighboring ranchers. More opportunities for people to judge their relationship, to whisper behind their hands. But with Connor beside her and the Morrison family's approval behind them, Margaret felt ready to face anything. The neighboring ranches turned out to be a mixed blessing. Some were welcoming, congratulating Connor and treating Margaret with respect. Others were less kind. Their wives in particular seemed to view Margaret with suspicion or pity. "I don't understand why he'd choose someone so old," one woman whispered, loudly enough for Margaret to hear. "He could have anyone." "He did choose anyone," another replied. "He chose her. Must be desperate for help with those poor motherless children." Margaret kept her head high, but the words stung. Connor, sensing her distress, cut the visit short. On the ride home, he was quiet, his jaw tight. Finally, he spoke. "I'm sorry you had to hear that." "It's nothing I haven't thought myself," Margaret admitted. Connor pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to face her. "Then we need to settle this once and for all." His hands gripped her shoulders. "Margaret, I'm not settling for you. I'm not choosing you out of desperation or convenience. I'm choosing you because you're the only woman I want. But those women, they're right. You could have someone younger, prettier." "I don't want younger or prettier," Connor interrupted fiercely. "I want real. I want honest. I want a woman who's lived long enough to know what matters. I want you, Margaret Hayes, with your grey hair and your laugh lines and your beautiful, courageous heart." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "I love you so much it scares me." "I love you too." Connor kissed her tears away. "And in 2 days, you're going to be my wife. Let the whole territory talk. I don't care about anyone's opinion but yours." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the Montana sky a brilliant blue. Margaret woke early, her stomach a mass of butterflies. Catherine Morrison arrived with the dressmakers to help her prepare, and Eleanor Morrison herself came to give Margaret a beautiful pearl necklace. "Something borrowed," the older woman said gruffly. "It was my mother's. Wear it today, and may it bring you as much happiness as it brought her." When Margaret finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The cream-colored dress fit perfectly, the pearls gleamed at her throat, and her hair, styled by Catherine herself, was elegant and timeless. "You're beautiful," Catherine said softly. "Absolutely beautiful." "I'm 42 years old," Margaret whispered. "And you look like a woman in love," Eleanor Morrison declared. "That's the most beautiful thing any woman can be. Now come, your groom is waiting, and Connor Blake is not a patient man." As if summoned by his words, Thomas came running around the corner of the house. "Papa, Mrs. Hayes, come quick! Sarah's walking!" They hurried inside to find Sarah taking wobbly steps toward Jack, who was kneeling with his arms outstretched. The little girl saw Connor and Margaret and changed direction, stumbling toward them with determination. "Come on, sweetheart," Margaret called, dropping to her knees. "Come to Mama." The words slipped out without thought, but the moment it did, Margaret froze. She looked up at Connor, afraid she'd overstepped, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Sarah took 3 more stumbling steps and fell into Margaret's arms, giggling with delight. Margaret held her close, feeling the warm weight of the child, smelling the sweet scent of her hair. "Did you hear that, Princess?" Connor's voice was rough as he knelt beside them. "Did you hear Mama call you?" Sarah looked up at Margaret with those bright blue eyes and said, clear as a bell, "Mama!" Margaret felt tears stream down her face. Thomas pressed against her side, and Connor's arms came around all of them, and for the first time in her life, Margaret understood what home truly meant. That night, after the children were in bed, Connor found Margaret in the kitchen. She was crying again, happy tears this time, and he pulled her into his arms. "Marry me," he said against her hair. "Not next month or next year. Marry me next week. I don't want to wait anymore." "Connor, I know all the arguments. I know people will talk. But Margaret, life is short and love is rare, and I'm not wasting another day without you being mine in every way." Margaret pulled back to look at him. "You're sure? Absolutely sure?" In answer, Connor kissed her, deeply, thoroughly, until she was breathless and clinging to him. When he finally released her, his eyes were dark with desire. "I've never been more sure of anything," he said. "Marry me." "Yes," Margaret whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed the following Sunday in a simple ceremony at the small church in Boulder Creek. Thomas stood proudly as his father's best man, and Sarah, clutching a handful of wildflowers, sat on Margaret's hip throughout the vows. There were whispers, of course, speculation about why a young, handsome rancher would marry an older widow. But when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Connor kissed his bride with such obvious tenderness that several women in the congregation sighed. The whispers changed to murmurs of approval. Jack hosted a small celebration at the ranch afterward, and as the sun set, Connor led Margaret away from the festivities to the porch, where they'd first confessed their feelings. "Happy, Mrs. Blake?" he asked, pulling her close. Margaret leaned into him, feeling his strength, his warmth. "Happier than I ever thought possible. It's only the beginning," Connor promised. He tilted her face up, his eyes soft in the fading light. "We're going to have a beautiful life together. You, me, and the children. And whatever else comes," Margaret added, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Connor's eyes widened. "Are you?" She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She discovered it just that morning, had almost been afraid to tell him so soon, but the joy that transformed his face erased all her doubts. "A baby," he breathed, his hand covering hers. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Connor laughed, the sound rich and full. "Happy? Margaret, I'm overwhelmed. I'm blessed. I'm the luckiest man alive." He kissed her again, soft and sweet. "You've given me everything. A home, a family, a reason to believe in tomorrow. You gave me the same," Margaret said. "I was so lost, Connor, so sure that my life was over. And then you looked at me like I was the most beautiful woman in the world, and I started to believe it." "You are beautiful," Connor said fiercely. "You're beautiful and strong and brave. And every day I wake up grateful that you answered my advertisement." From inside the house, they could hear Thomas's laughter and Sarah's delighted squeals as Jack played with them. The ranch stretched out around them, wild and beautiful under the Montana sky. "Come to bed with me," Connor whispered, his voice husky. "I want to show my wife exactly how much I love her." Margaret felt heat flood her cheeks. "Connor Blake, are you trying to scandalize me?" His smile was wicked. "Is it working?" She took his hand, leading him toward the house. "Terribly." Their wedding night was everything Margaret had feared she was too old to experience. Passion and tenderness, desire and laughter, the joy of being loved completely by a man who saw all of her and loved what he saw. "You're so beautiful," Connor whispered against her skin, his hands reverent as they explored her body. "So perfect." "I'm not perfect," Margaret said, but her voice trembled with pleasure. "I'm scarred and old and—" "You're mine," Connor interrupted, his eyes blazing. "And that makes you perfect to me." He made love to her slowly, carefully, as if she was something precious. And when she cried out his name, when he followed her over the edge, whispering words of love against her throat, Margaret finally understood what she'd been missing all those years. This wasn't just desire or duty. This was being cherished. This was being seen. This was love in its truest form. Afterward, wrapped in Connor's arms, listening to his heartbeat slow beneath her ear, Margaret felt peace settle over her like a blanket. "What are you thinking?" Connor asked, his fingers trailing patterns on her shoulder. "That I almost didn't come," Margaret said softly. "I almost convinced myself I was too old for new adventures, too old for love." Connor pressed a kiss to her hair. "And now? Now I know that it's never too late." She tilted her head to look at him. "You taught me that. You looked at me and saw not what I'd lost, but what I still had to give." "You taught me something too," Connor said. "You taught me that loving someone who truly knows life's pain makes the joy that much sweeter. Mary was my first love, and I'll always treasure that. But you, Margaret, you're my forever love." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Finally, Connor spoke again. "Tell me about the baby." "When?" "Late spring, I think." Margaret's hand found his, guiding it to her stomach. "Are you really happy? I know we didn't plan—" "Margaret." Connor shifted so he could look into her eyes. "This baby is a gift, a symbol of our new life together. How could I be anything but overjoyed? Some men might worry about a woman my age." He silenced her with a kiss. "Stop. We're not going to spend our marriage with you questioning whether I truly want you. I do. I want all of you, your past, your present, your future. I want every day and every night for the rest of our lives." Margaret felt tears slip down her temples. "I love you so much." "I love you too." Connor pulled her closer until she was tucked against his side, her head on his chest. "Now sleep, my love. Tomorrow we start our real life together." The months that followed were the happiest of Margaret's life. Her pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Connor was endlessly attentive, rubbing her feet when they swelled, bringing her breakfast in bed, singing to the baby through her stomach in a way that made her laugh and cry at the same time. Thomas was thrilled at the prospect of being a big brother again. "I'm going to teach the baby everything," he announced importantly. "How to ride and rope and everything." Sarah, though she didn't fully understand, would pat Margaret's growing belly and say, "Baby," with great satisfaction. The ranch prospered under Connor's management. With Margaret handling the household efficiently, he was able to focus more on the business, expanding their herd and their land. But he never let work consume him the way he had before. Every evening, he made time for family, playing with the children, sitting with Margaret, planning for their future. "I want to build you a bigger house," he said one night as they sat on the porch, Margaret's feet in his lap as he rubbed them. "Something worthy of a woman like you." "This house is perfect," Margaret protested. "It's our home. It's small, and when the baby comes, we'll need more room." Connor's eyes gleamed with plans. "I want to give you everything, Margaret. Everything you deserve." "I have everything I need," she said softly. "I have you and the children. That's more than I ever dreamed of." The baby came on a warm June evening, after a labor that was mercifully short. Connor held Margaret's hand through it all, whispering encouragement, refusing to leave her side despite the midwife's scandalized protests. When their son finally arrived, red-faced and wailing, Connor cut the cord with shaking hands and then held Margaret while she cried tears of joy and relief. "He's perfect," Connor whispered, staring at the tiny bundle in his wife's arms. "You're both perfect." They named him James, after Margaret's father, and when Connor introduced his new son to Thomas and Sarah the next morning, Margaret's heart swelled, watching her family gather around the new baby. "This is your brother," Connor told the children, "and we're all going to take care of him together, just like we take care of each other." Thomas peered at the baby's scrunched face. "He's awful small, Papa." "You were that small once," Connor said with a laugh. "And look at you now." Sarah reached out a tentative finger to touch James's hand, and when the baby's tiny fingers closed around hers, she looked up at Margaret with wonder. "Baby," she said. "Yes, sweetheart," Margaret said. "Our baby." The first year of James's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless joy. Connor was a devoted father, walking the floor with the baby when he fussed, changing diapers without complaint, singing the same lullabies to James that he sang to Sarah. On their first anniversary, Connor surprised Margaret with a new dress, deep blue silk that made her eyes sparkle. "Connor, this is too extravagant," she protested, but she couldn't hide her delight. "Nothing is too extravagant for my wife," he said firmly. "Put it on. We're going out." Jack had agreed to watch the children, and Connor took Margaret to the nicest restaurant in Boulder Creek. It was small and simple by city standards, but to Margaret, who had spent a year cooking and cleaning and caring for babies, it felt like luxury. Over dinner, Connor took her hand. "This has been the best year of my life," he said. "Every day with you is a gift, Margaret." Even the hard days?" she asked with a smile. "The days when all three children are crying and the stove won't light and the chickens get into the garden? Especially those days." Connor's eyes were serious. "Because we face them together. Because at the end of those days, I get to fall asleep with you in my arms and wake up to your face. You're a romantic, Connor Blake. Only with you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I have something for you." Inside was a delicate gold locket. When Margaret opened it, she found tiny portraits. Connor on one side and on the other, a group portrait of all three children. "Connor," she breathed. "It's beautiful." "Turn it over." Engraved on the back were the words, "It's never too late for love." Margaret looked up at her husband through tears. "How did you—" "I remember what you said, that you almost didn't come because you thought you were too old." Connor stood and moved behind her to clasp the locket around her neck. "I want you to remember every day that taking that chance brought you to me, to us." He bent to kiss her neck, and Margaret shivered with pleasure. "Take me home," she whispered. "Not yet." Connor returned to his seat with a smile. "We have dessert coming, and then I thought we might take a walk. It's a beautiful night." They did walk, hand in hand through the quiet streets of Boulder Creek. People nodded to them with smiles. The Blakes were well liked in the community, their obvious devotion to each other and their family, softening even the most critical tongues. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked, as they stood looking up at the stars. Marrying someone older? Connor pulled her into his arms. I regret that I didn't meet you sooner, that we lost years we could have had together. But regret marrying you? Never. Even when I'm 50 and you're still young. Even when we're both 90 and sitting on our porch watching our grandchildren play. Connor tilted her face up to his. Margaret, age is just numbers. What we have, this love, this life, it's eternal. It doesn't diminish with time, it only grows stronger. She kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. When they finally broke apart, Connor was breathing hard. Home, he said roughly. Now, before I scandalize the whole town by making love to my wife in the middle of Main Street. Margaret laughed, feeling young and desired and cherished. Race you to the wagon. They drove home faster than was probably wise, laughing like children. Jack met them at the door with a knowing smile. All three are asleep, he reported, and I'll be in the bunkhouse if you need me. Which you won't. Connor barely waited for the foreman to leave before he was pulling Margaret toward their bedroom, kissing her with an urgency that made her pulse race. Their lovemaking that night was passionate and playful, tender and intense. Afterward, Margaret lay in Connor's arms, feeling completely content. Thank you, she whispered. For what? For seeing me, for loving me, for giving me a family and a home and a life I never dreamed I could have. Connor's arms tightened around her. Thank you for answering my advertisement, for being brave enough to take a chance on a broken man with 2 small children and a remote ranch. You weren't broken, Margaret said. You were healing. We healed each other. They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, while outside the Montana night spread its blanket of stars over the ranch they'd built together. Years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Thomas grew tall and strong, learning to run the ranch alongside his father. Sarah became a bright, curious girl who loved reading and horses in equal measure. James proved to be a perfect blend of both parents. Connor's adventurous spirit tempered by Margaret's gentle wisdom. And through it all, Connor and Margaret's love only deepened. They had their disagreements, of course, what couple didn't, but they'd learned to face everything together, with honesty and respect and unwavering commitment. On Margaret's 50th birthday, Connor threw her a party that brought together friends from all over the territory. Margaret protested the fuss, but secretly she was delighted. That evening, as the celebration wound down and the children entertained the last guests, Connor led Margaret away to the porch, their spot, where so many important moments had happened. 50 years old, he said, pulling her close, and more beautiful than ever. Margaret laughed. You're a terrible liar. I'm not lying. Connor's hands cupped her face, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. You're beautiful, Margaret. The silver in your hair, the laugh lines around your eyes. Every year with you has been a gift, and it shows in your face. I love you, Margaret said simply. I love you too. Connor kissed her softly. Do you remember what you said to me that first night, when I kissed you for the first time? I said I was too old for you. And do you remember what I said? Margaret smiled. You said, then teach me how to love. You did teach me, Connor said. You taught me that love isn't about age or timing or what society thinks. You taught me that real love is about seeing someone's soul and choosing them. Every day, no matter what. You taught me the same, Margaret said. You taught me that it's never too late for second chances, that being older doesn't mean being done with life, that the right person sees past the surface to the heart beneath. Connor pulled her into a dance, humming softly, and Margaret rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat, the same steady rhythm that had comforted her for 8 years now. Inside, she could hear Thomas laughing at something Jack said, Sarah singing to James, the sounds of family and home and love. No regrets, Connor whispered. Margaret looked up at her husband, this man who had seen her not as too old, but as exactly right, who had loved her not despite her age, but because of everything it represented. Wisdom, strength, resilience, depth. Not a single one, she said. And as Connor kissed her under the Montana stars, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that some love stories don't begin when you're young. Some of them begin when you're ready, when you've lived enough to appreciate what you have, when you've learned that the best things in life are worth waiting for. She had been 42 when she stepped off that stagecoach, convinced her life was ending. Instead, it had been just beginning. And now, at 50, with silver in her hair and a husband who still looked at her like she was the most precious thing in his world, with children who called her Mama, and a home filled with laughter and love, Margaret Hayes Blake knew exactly what she'd tell anyone who said they were too old for new beginnings. It's never too late. Love doesn't have an expiration date. And sometimes the greatest adventures begin when you're brave enough to believe you deserve them. No matter how many years you've lived. Connor pulled back from the kiss, his eyes soft in the lamplight spilling from the house. What are you thinking about? About how grateful I am, Margaret said. About how one decision, one moment of courage changed everything. You changed everything, Connor corrected. The moment you stepped off that stagecoach, my life began again. Our lives began again, Margaret said. Together, and there on the porch of their ranch, with the sound of their family inside and the vast Montana sky above, Connor Blake held his wife close and thanked God for bringing her to him. This woman who had taught him that love knows no age, that second chances are real, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the words, "I'm too old for you," because in the end, she hadn't been too old. She'd been exactly right. And their love, built on respect and passion, and the deep understanding that comes from truly knowing life, would last forever.